side pointers, we're going to cover big life changes that can have a big impact on your tax return. So let's get started. The number one big life change that I see that impacts people's tax returns are when their filing status changes. Now, that is simply when you go from either a single taxpayer to married, or married to single in the way of a sad divorce, or married to single to remarried. In any case, it really is a simple change in your filing status. Now, why is that a complicated big tax life issue? Because as it relates to your filing status, there are different tax rate tables, so you pay at different rates. There are different limitations on a variety of tax breaks, like the earned income credit. So you have different credit amounts, different deduction amounts, different tax rate amounts, and other issues related to your filing status. So if that changes from one year to the next, your tax return will also change, and the bottom line tax amount could likely change as well. So watch out if you have a filing status change. That is big life change number one. A second big life change that we see with a lot of taxpayers has to do with dependents. Now, dependents used to be just your son and daughter on your tax return, but that world's gotten a greatly deal more complicated over time. And the reason for that is so many dollars attached to dependents on your tax return. And it's one of the trickiest parts of the tax code. And in the world we live in today, there's a lot of different types of dependents, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But dependents can be your dependent, you can have shared custody or disputed custody, and the dollars can be enormous. So you need to be clear on who is your dependent, who else might be claiming that dependent, and doing it right on your tax return because the dollars are very important. And secondly, if you get it wrong, if someone cross-claims a dependent and they file before you, that's not necessarily the rule. It's not a first come gets the dependent. It's who the rules apply to gets the dependent. But if two people file for the same dependent, it can add complexity and delays to a tax return. So watch out for dependents. If you have them and they're anything else but crystal clear, you got to do it right or you could have problems. Dependents 2.0 is the expanded definition of dependents. It's no longer just a son and daughter. It could be an adopted child, a fostered child, shared custody, as we've already talked about. It can be a dependent parent that you're taking care of, an elder parent. It can be a dependent relative that's related to you that you're taking care of. The bottom line is simply this. If you have someone that you're providing care for, financial and otherwise, you might have a dependent on your tax return. And as goes a lot of tax benefits, and that can add complexity to your tax return. So watch out for dependents, even the non-common ones. Another situation that can complicate a tax return, and we're starting to see a lot more of this, especially in the pandemic, is side gig income or side hustle or self-employment or whatever you want to call it. And whether you have that full-time or part-time, or you're doing it or your spouse is doing it, if you have side gig income, that's a whole different way of thinking about your taxes. It's not like being an employee and you have your wages and then you have your taxes withheld. If you're a self-employed person, you have to calculate your taxes yourself and pay them in quarterly. You also have to keep track of your expenses. And there are many, many tax deductible expenses that can offset your income. You leave them off, they stay off. The bottom line is simply this. If you're earning income on the side and you put that on your tax return, you need to account for it correctly, pay the minimum that you can, keep up with all the deductions like automobile, home office, and the other expenses that you might incur, and pay the minimum amount of tax that you can. And the final thing you need to know about related to self-employment or side gig income is new this year, there's a new reporting requirement. So if you're getting paid for your side hustle through an electronic platform, think Zelle or Apple Pay or Venmo, there's a new rule that requires those companies to report to you how much money you got during the year. Should have been tracking that yourself anyway. But they're also sending that information to the IRS in 2022. So the IRS will know how much money you had, and you'll know how much money you had, and you have to account for that on your tax return. Doesn't mean it's all taxable. As I said, there are a lot of tax deductible expenses, and we talk about those a lot more in one of our future broadcasts, but you do have to account for it more this year than ever, especially if it's over $600, which is just about everybody. Another issue we're seeing is if people have multiple jobs, and a new job or a second job or a third or fourth or fifth job doesn't necessarily mean you have a more complicated tax return, but multiple jobs can add to tax complexity, especially if your earnings go up and your withholdings might not reflect the higher income overall and the higher tax bracket. We really see this a lot and has a big impact on refund shock when you have 2 or 3 or 4 jobs during the year and your income keeps going up, but your withholding in each job is kind of at that lower level. You add it all up and you're a higher tax bracket, you may get a lower refund, or you may even owe the IRS. So just know that many jobs have a higher tax complexity and risk factor if you have those and they're higher income jobs. related to higher multi-employer jobs are multi-state tax returns. And we're starting to see a lot more of this is related to the pandemic. People who work in multiple states. Now, you may move for a new job, you may move for true love, or you may move just to get back in with your parents. But if you live in two different states, or live and work in two different states during the tax year, you probably have a more complicated tax return. You may even have to file in two separate states, unless one of those states is like Florida or Texas or some of the others with no income. But 43 or so do have. And so if you're living and moving around and you're working in multiple states, just know you have a more complicated tax situation. And the good news on that front is you generally don't owe taxes in both states, or you don't have to pay double taxation. You should get a credit in one state on the other tax return. But if you do it wrong and you don't file for that credit, you may end up paying taxes twice, and no state's going to just say, oh, hey, you don't owe here because you live over there. Here's money back. You do it wrong, they keep the money. So make sure if you're in multi-states, you do it right. And finally, of my short list of life changes, one of the biggest life changes that taxpayers enjoy is when they retire. Now, that sounds like it's a great time, and it is a great time for those retirees. Congratulations, well earned. But that does not mean your taxes are easier. In fact, that first year, and even for several years, your taxes could be much more complicated than the years before. You may have new types of income, retirement income. Some may be taxable, some may not be taxable. Some may be partially taxable, like Social Security benefits. And if you kept a part-time job on the side because you like to work, then you could have the worst of both worlds, income from wages and also retirement to contend with. Simply know this: if you have retirement in your future, both current or in the near future, you could have a more complicated tax return. And that doesn't necessarily mean higher taxes, but it could be exposure to risk shock, because it's a much different situation. So be sure to get some guidance on, what to expect, what to do, what to watch for if retirement's in your near future. Now, this short list of life changes, which can lead to complicated tax changes, is by no means all encompassing. There are many others. You can have several of these at the same time, and that makes an even more complicated tax return. It just simply means it's going to be different than the year before, and you need to proceed cautiously. You need to understand what the issues are. You need to get guidance when you have questions, and you need to probably take some actions and make sure you're properly protected against refund shock come tax time. So all you need to know is there's a lot of information to watch for and to watch out for on any life change. This short list can create some even bigger issues, and be sure you get help from a competent tax pro for any and all of your questions. And from all of us here at Jackson Hewitt, we look forward to seeing you on a future cast of our Tax Talk Live.